Welcome to the fifth session of the webinar series Housing 2.0, organized by Urban Housing Practitioners Hub with the support of the IDB Group. Remember that we have translation to Spanish available. To start this final session of our series, we are honored to welcome Paloma Silva, Lead Specialist, Housing and Urban Development Division HUD from the Climate and Change and Sustainable Development sector from the Inter-American Development Bank, a leading voice in housing policy and urban development in our region, with extensive experience bridging public policy, finance, and housing system. She has played a key role in shaping innovative approaches to address housing challenges in the region. Paloma will open our final session and introduce our moderator, helping set the session and introduce a forward-looking conversation on the future of housing systems. Welcome, Paloma.
Thank you, Marina. It's a pleasure to be here as we close this Housing 2.0 series with a session. The future is here. How we can design, build, and live with algorithms, which has brought together such a rich set of perspective on the future of housing in our region. Today's conversation invites us to reflect not only on the opportunities that technology like AI present, but also on the responsibility we share to ensure they're aligned with equity, inclusion, and public purpose. To guide us through this discussion, I'm delighted to introduce our moderator, Boris Kurnet, Principal Economist at the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, whose extensive experience in economic policy brings a thoughtful and strategic lens to this conversation. Boris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paloma. I'm delighted to be here to talk about housing on a question that is no longer theory. Things are moving very quickly, and that is how do we design, build, and live with algorithms that power artificial intelligence. They are very rapidly moving from the margins to the core of housing systems. These algorithms are influencing the ways homes are designed, also the organization, optimization of construction itself, and then the management of the housing stock, and thereby impacting on everyday life, increasingly for all of us. So AI is not just another layer of technological innovation at the margin. It is becoming part of the infrastructure that shapes housing systems. This is a very promising transformation, but it also comes with risks. The tools that bring greater efficiency, they can also embed existing inequalities and deepen exclusion. They can entrench biases. And this is a concern that is particularly relevant in the Latin America and the Caribbean region, where housing systems operate under conditions of informality, data gaps, and widespread inequality. So today our focus is on what AI can do, but also importantly on how it should be governed and with whom this governance should be set up, organized, implemented. So we will explore how AI is transforming housing systems, where are the opportunities, identify risks, and also look at what it will take to ensure that this transformation aligns with the public policy objectives of raising living standards, improving social cohesion, and protecting the environment. That is a conversation that is about systems, policy, and people, not only about technology. And so to ground this discussion, we will begin with a systems level perspective. We look at how artificial intelligence, data, and sensing technologies are reshaping urban systems and what that implies in particular for housing. And for that, we are very pleased to welcome our distinguished keynote speaker, Michael Beatty, Chair of the Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis, CASA, a well-functioning acronym at UCL. So Michael's keynote on AI and simulation in planning cities will provide us with a systems-level perspective on how AI, data, computational models are reshaping the way we understand cities and increasingly the way they're being governed. So we are very much eager to hear from the pioneering work that you've led on these complex and evolving systems that cities are. And without further ado, over to you, Michael.
I'm just getting myself organized here. I'm going to show a PowerPoint. And I'm going to share my screen at this point. Let me have a look, see how we go. Now, can everybody see the PowerPoint?
Yes, it is coming up nicely.
Very good. Okay. Okay, let me begin. I'm going to talk, as Boris has just said, about AI and how AI is beginning to enter all kinds of domains. But of course, in terms of cities and housing, then this is an area that we're going to concentrate on today. One of the things about AI is that it is really everywhere, in a sense. Every domain that we're thinking about can be affected by AI in terms of data and methods, which are moving very fast at the moment. So let me tell you what I'm going to talk about. I do have a paper. Which I will share with you. You can get access to it afterwards. But let me tell you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about in the next 15, 20 minutes or so. I'm going to say a little bit about computers in planning and the origins. Of course, computers have been around since really the Second World War, basically, 75 years or so. And right from the beginning, AI was thought about in terms of computing. This is not a new thing. It's a very old thing. It goes back to the roots of digital computing. And there's been a short and turbulent history over the last 75 years, in some senses, as we'll see. And indeed, there is still a great deal of dispute about whether or not we're talking about intelligence as we think of it in terms of ourselves, intelligent people in that sense, and intelligence in terms of the machine. There's a great controversy between what we might call natural intelligence versus artificial intelligence. So AI is everywhere, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And it's changing the way we look at the world. A lot of the way we looked at the world in terms of cities until quite recently was to build simple deductive models, basically, in a sense, in the fashion almost of physics and to some extent economics. More recently, with the development of data, which is absolutely central to AI works on very large databases. There's been a shift towards much more of an inductive point of view, much more sort of a data-driven society, if you like, in this sense. And that's both good and bad, as I'll talk about. And it really relates to this current preoccupation with this term machine learning that's sort of begun to enter everywhere in AI. I'll say a little bit about developing AI for cities and planning. I want to talk a little bit about how we simulated cities in the past and how we might begin to simulate them, i.e. predict with them in that sense using AI in their context. So towards the end of the talk, I'll look at some specific examples and then really round it off with some thoughts about automation, because to some extent AI is an extension of automation generally in that sense, and how it's beginning to change planning practice, how we actually make plans, how we understand cities. Cities themselves are becoming computable in this particular context. So AI is not only being used to think about cities, it's also being used to actually function in cities in that context. So there's a widespread circularity in all of this that's important. Okay, the paper that I suggested, there is a paper that has come out relatively recently, a couple of weeks ago, basically, in one of the Springer journals called Discover Cities, the evolution of AI and city planning. And it's open source, so open access, I should say, so you can actually download it. I'll show this slide again at the end of the talk, basically, in a sense. Okay, so let me quickly begin to sketch some of the background, basically. As I said, the computer was invented 75 years or so ago, just before and during World War II. It's really based on two key assumptions. This is known to us all anyway, but I'll make the point. Anything that can be reduced to the binary code to yes or no, black and white, 0 and 1, basically, is computable in the sense of digital computation. The second point is that we can embody digital computation, the idea of 0 or 1, black and white, and so on, as electrical switching using the binary code from near 0 to 1. And we can embody all of this kind of switching, if you like, within silicon, basically. And this has led to massive miniaturization. If, for example, all we had was the binary code, and we didn't have silicon in that sense, then really we'd be nowhere in a sense. But what's really happening is that the idea of switching zeros and ones is in terms of miniaturization in the silicon chips. And we hear all about Moore's law. Moore's law is that the memory and the speed of computing is doubling every 18 months and has been for the last sort of 40 years. And that's led to these massive chips, very powerful chips. NVIDIA, for example, which is the world's biggest company, I think, at the moment, or the most valuable company, basically, have these very powerful sort of chips, basically. And to some extent, this is an ongoing process. We've seen nothing yet, in some sense. Okay, now back in the day, it was Alan Turing and John von Neumann who invented the digital computer. They saw more clearly than most people back in the 1940s that the computer was a universal machine. If you could reduce everything to the binary code, then anything that could be thought of in those terms could be computable. And of course, most people didn't think that graphics or sound and so on was computable, but they did think that scientific method was computable. So the early computers were really based on addressing problems of physics and so on, using digital computing. But then very quickly with miniaturization, what really began to happen was that we could handle all sorts of problems that were really not considered to be computable. Graphics came onto the scene really with the PC in the 1980s and so on. And there's lots and lots of different things since then, basically, lots and lots of switches to the idea of what can be computable and what not. Now, almost in planning, in urban planning, for example, almost from the beginning, really, the beginning of computing in the 40s, by the 1950s, a large number of social and economic systems began to be computable in that sense. And in my own field of land use transportation, demographic forecasting, econometric models, and so on, these were first built with the interstate highway system in the United States in the 1950s. So Detroit and Chicago had big projects related to land use modeling and transport modeling, basically using the then generation of computers. And so modeling cities came onto the agenda, generating scenarios, of course, making predictions once we had the models, designing plans, visualization, mapping, and GIS came onto the agenda with graphics in the 1970s, 1980s. And then automation of the planning system, which is proceeding apace. Some of the cutting edge issues in terms of AI in planning are not to do with the nature of cities. They're more to do with the nature of the planning system, actually automating the planning system and actually producing the sort of data that's needed in planning in much more intelligent ways. So to some extent, really, to summarize all of this, artificial intelligence is really synonymous with computers. It's taken a long time, 70 years or so, for it to really begin to take off, basically, in some sense. And I'll talk in the next 5 minutes or so about some of these issues. Now, Alan Turing himself wrote a paper in the journal Mind in 1950 called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. And to some extent, the use of the word intelligence was really mirrored on the notion that the computer was like a brain in some sense, that our model of intelligence and our model of systems basically really related in the middle of the 20th century and a little before to the idea of the brain, basically. And it was John McCarthy who held a meeting in 1956 in Dartmouth, New Hampshire, where he gathered together what were really just a handful of people working on computing and called the meeting artificial intelligence. He called it AI, basically, because it was a nice sort of short acronym, basically, where he could actually use it to get funding from the National Science Foundation, basically. And in the very early days of computing, in terms of intelligence, the idea of the network and the brain came onto the agenda. And one of the kind of big changes in AI at the very beginning was a switch really from scientific and symbolic processing towards statistical processing. Indeed, the history of artificial intelligence is one of switching really from deductive to inductive, from explicit scientific activity to a statistical activity. I'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, now here are the founding fathers, basically. There's one Nobel Prize winner there, Herbert Simon. Now, Herbert Simon got the Nobel Prize for economics, in fact, not for computing or anything like that. But there's some very famous names there, Claude Shannon, information theory, and so on, McCarthy himself. And then picture on the left there of Alan Turing, basically, in 1950. That's his famous paper on computing machinery and intelligence. And then Fei Lai, who is the Chinese lady who is the inventor of what's called ImageNet. And although some of these characters are getting Nobel Prizes for it now in terms of AI and so on, it's possible that Fei might get a Nobel Prize for her work. Let's hope she does, basically, in that sense. Okay, so those are the early ideas in a sense. In some sense, AI is more like natural intelligence than artificial in some sense, because we're thinking of it in the early days of mirroring what we do. Good definition from The Economist. Really not a strong definition, but it says that in The Economist a couple of years ago, it said AI can be described as the art of getting computers to do things that seem smart to humans, basically. Well, to some extent, that's clearly true. The other, of course, in a sense, is that AI has changed, and the next few slides will show how it has changed since the very early days, basically. What's really come onto the agenda with massive miniaturization and powerful computers is the notion of data, big data originally in that sense. But very largely what we now see in terms of AI, which is working on very big databases, large language models and so on, ChatGPT, etc., is really based on the notion that if you actually put all of the data you can do, as much as you can, basically into the machine and begin to crunch it, then to some extent, this is the kind of intelligence that is being generated. And of course, whether or not it's intelligent really is the $64,000 question, really. Useful, yes, but whether or not it's intelligence in the sense of we've always thought of it for a long time, basically, we don't know. Okay, so AI is everywhere, and to some extent, it's synonymous with computing in this particular context. And I've written a book called The Computable City, basically, which really doesn't talk particularly about artificial intelligence per se, but it talks about how computers have begun to permeate everywhere rather than in intelligence, basically. So not only computer models of how we go about solving and thinking about housing problems, but how the city itself is being embedded with computers, basically. So the very computer I'm showing this PowerPoint slide on, for example, I can also use the same computer to actually think about the building I'm in and the area of the city I'm in and build models of that sort in some sense. And these computers can actually be embedded into the fabric of the building. That the room I'm in here basically is quite wired in some sense, in the sense that everything is really beginning to merge into each other in a computable sense. Okay, the short turbulent history. I said originally that in the very early days, AI was really about scientific simulation, about symbolic processing in this particular context. And in the very early days, the idea that you could link things in some sense in a network really came onto the agenda. A man called Rosenblatt in the 1950s basically developed a very simple model of how you could actually take an input, link it to various sorts of other inputs basically, and generate outputs basically. And these were referred to as neural nets. They could be used to modify lots of different problems basically in that sense. And they could be adapted in this particular context. What happened, of course, was unfortunately Rosenblatt passed away in a sailing accident in the 1950s, basically. And to some extent, the field was very small then, but the neural net analogy, the idea of the brain being a network, basically, and this being the essence of thinking about how intelligence could be simulated. This really went onto the back burner to some extent. It was difficult. I mean, it wasn't obvious that many of these early ideas were very useful in that sense. And what really happened in the 1970s and 80s was that AI switched really from symbolic things to a rule-based system. Expert systems came onto the agenda, which are much more modest in many senses, rule-based systems in this particular context and so on. And in our own field of urban planning, basically, a number of things were there's I'll just point you out, there's a paper there in Computers, Environment, and Urban Systems. The name itself of the journal basically is symptomatic of what was happening in this area. 1989, it's a paper, an editorial written by myself and Tony Ye from the University of Hong Kong. They're called The Promise of Expert Systems for Urban Planning. This was rule-based systems, if this, then that, and so on. And here in 1997, which is almost 30 years ago, a book by the Openshaw, Stan and Christine Openshaw, called Artificial Intelligence in Geography, in that sense. And so to some extent, this is really symptomatic of the fact that these ideas are really deeply embedded in the history of computing ever since, basically. Okay, so AI is everywhere. There are different types of AI. Let me just say that go back to this point I've been making, that a lot of our thinking about what happens in cities and how we begin to change cities basically is based on this notion that we build deductive models in the tradition of physics and economics. And that has begun to change with the development of large-scale databases and our ability to process them. So in some senses, we've moved from a deductive models of thinking basically, to inductive, basically, meaning data-led or data-driven. And to some extent, the great issue in artificial intelligence is whether we can actually take the best of the deductive world and put it with the inductive world in that sense. And there really is a lot of debate about this at the present time, basically. Okay, deductive versus inductive, basically. And what I'm really saying is that the switch from AI for 70 years or so ago towards modern AI, basically, is a switch from deductive to inductive, from theory-driven, if you like, to data-driven in some senses. Okay, so we can make various distinctions, between different types of AI. A lot of AI is essentially statistical in some sense, and But of course, what has come onto the agenda is the notion that AI might be generative. It might be not only predictive, but it might be prescriptive in some sense, and we can use it in terms of design in that sense. And so this is another area of AI. To some extent, all science is generative. I mean, in the sense that if you do science at all, you're looking for solutions and you're looking for discoveries and things of that sort to some extent. So the distinction between generative and, I think, discriminative AI is not as profound, I think, as many people think in that sense. And so to some extent, most of what we talk about when we use large language models and ChatGPT and so on is generative AI. It's generating things that we don't know in some sense. But as I said, most of science is really about this, basically. Okay, there's lots of different things going on in the whole area that AIs are being pitted against each other and linked to each other and so on. And they are really beginning to emerge as really basic ways of thinking about how we can manipulate all sorts of data, basically, in that sense. So let me say about the current preoccupation on machine learning, and let me tell you a little bit about this. The idea that we have a model is contained on the bold thing there, y equals a function of x. All of us probably know a little bit about statistics and how you can you can predict fit a regression model and so on. And in some senses, I mean, modern AI is no more than fitting regression type models, linear models, to very, very large data sets. And when we're talking about large here, we're talking about billions and billions of items in terms of the data. All these fancy AI companies, OpenAI and so on, Anthropic, etc. These various AI companies specialize in searching for the world's data and putting it together in a form where we can begin to actually search for pattern and meaning in that particular data. And to some extent, the process of doing this is often referred to as machine learning in that sense, which is not very different from the things that we learn in Statistics 101 in terms of regression, etc. Now, here's an example of the idea of the network, which really runs throughout a lot of AI. There's a great quote from Michael Wooldridge in his book called A Brief History of Artificial Intelligence, Flatiron Books, New York, 2021. Great little book. Which gives a history of it much better than I can ever give in that sense. And he says in this particular book, the goal of machine learning is to have programs that can compute a desired output from a given input without being given an explicit recipe for doing this. Our theoretical models of cities have an explicit recipe from taking the inputs and generating the outputs, basically. What basically Wooldridge is saying is that AI type models, they do the same basically, but we don't know what the recipe is. The recipe can be just random links. So if you have a bunch of inputs and a bunch of outputs and you link them basically randomly in a sense, there are mechanisms out there in science that enable us to actually make sense of how the inputs turn into the outputs. And this is a good example here. So we have X, which is what we know, and Y is what we want to predict, basically. So we have that data, and we basically throw a lot of other issues of data and pattern at the neural net in this particular context, and you can begin to see how we can link the various layers together. We can build different hidden layers of data. So we start with data at X and we end with the prediction at Y. And we have lots of intermediate data which really pertain to the problem in that sense. And we can link it in countless different ways. And one of the great successes of machine learning and what we see in terms of large language models and so on is that this model has been widely replicated behind the scenes, basically, and enables us to actually produce quite good answers to certain sorts of questions. Now, one of the basic problems, of course, is that what do all these links mean? Nobody knows in that sense because they're actually configured randomly. There is some work going on to actually look at the architectures, how X relates to Y, basically. But generally speaking, at the end of the day, nobody quite knows why they work, basically, in that sense. And of course, if we don't know why something works, then if it produces poor things or bad things, basically, in a sense, then we begin to lose confidence. The great thing about traditional science, the deductive basis of science, is that we know why things work, basically. In a sense, we know how Y X turns into Y. In this particular context, we don't know. So that's essentially the essence of what's going on in AI at the present time. And as you can see, as computers get faster and bigger and more memories and so on, then the size of these problems can grow exponentially in that sense. We don't know what the links mean. This is data-driven sort of AI in this particular context. And let me show you an example of what we've been doing in terms of thinking about how to model these sorts of ideas. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you an example of how we build a model of the demand for land use and activities in a city, and how we can actually pit this against the supply, and how we can use the deductive models, basically, of demand, and then inductive models of supply. And the supply side is much more related to questions of housing and land use in this particular context. What we're doing is we're building a model, or we over a number of years, we've been building a model of all British cities. That the whole of Britain is divided up into about 8,500 zones. These are like census tracts in a sense. We look at all the relationships between the census tracts. So if we've got 8,500 zones, basically, then we've got 71 million links. These are the transport links, basically, in this particular context. So our model is a land use transport model. There's lots of deductive models such as gravity, radiation models, and so on, which have been used, discrete choice and so on, which have been used to actually make these things work, basically. So here's our model, basically. This is, if you like, the deductive thing. And what we're going to show is, or what we're going to indicate is, that we can replace a lot of this with machine learning. So here's employment and population, etc. This is our block model that enables us to predict population and employment in small areas with transportation linking them in this particular context. So that's our basic model. Now, I'm just going to throw you up a couple of equations here. That population depends on employment and employment depends on population. They look ferocious, but all we have there is a reduced form, simple model of how these things relate to one another, and the many elaborations of these things. These are the sort of things that get used fairly routinely at one level, basically, in a sense. So all of that really is traditional scientific thinking in the urban planning field. One of the things that we don't have really in these models is a good aspect of the supply side of the model, basically, in a sense. This I should just give you a picture of what the model does. This is Britain, England, Scotland, and Wales, not Northern Ireland, because the model is based on flows between origins and destinations, and they depend on distance and travel time. And of course, when we get Ireland basically here, then it's very difficult to actually model these flows across the sea and so on, in sense, on boats. Anyway, that's our model basically. And as you can see, these show the settlement pattern of Britain, basically. So there's lots of things we've done with this. This is the demand side model, and these are the networks. So this is our stock in trade, if you like. Okay, and these things existed really from the 50s onwards. And I guess the point I'm making is that they're beginning to be replaced to some extent by artificial intelligence and machine learning in that sense. This is we call a digital twin because we can actually play around with it in lots of different ways, basically, in a sense. Now, one of the things that these models do is to think about how we can actually generate plans, how we can use them to generate plans. Let me just go back to a picture here. What I say here is if we put new towns in, or new transport links and so on, then of course these are the inputs, and we use our traditional models to produce the outputs in this particular context. And of course, what we're really beginning to do is to think about how we model the supply side. What I've shown you there is the demand side of the picture. The supply side is the supply of land and the supply of housing. And what we've been doing is building a neural net model of the housing market, which we pit against the demand side of things in this particular context. So there's lots of ways of doing this. This is our demand side. This is our supply side, I should say. And typically, actually, the picture that you've got here, the picture we've got here is of Oxfordshire, basically. The top right picture is the Oxfordshire divided into small zones or census tracts. And all of these pictures immediately on the left there are different types of factors which are influencing the provision of, let's say, housing demand in these different areas around Oxford. Now, what we want to do is to predict the best areas for housing demand. What we really want to do is to simulate what actually happens in Oxford, basically, in that sense, on the supply side, basically. And I've got a sketch really of a neural net of how these different layers of data, think of them as layers of data, and think of them in terms of ChatGPT as millions of layers, really, in that sense. All I'm showing you here is a kind of a sketch, basically, in that sense, and how we can begin to link these things together and begin to search for pattern, basically. So all of this stuff is basically fed into our other stuff, basically, in that sense. And here are some pictures showing you how we can get different demand sides and so on. And that really sums it up. On the left-hand side, we've got our land use transport modeling for Oxford, which is the traditional model I've just shown you. And then on the right-hand side, we've got the neural net production of the supply side, basically, and we're putting the demand and the supply together. So to some extent, you can think of this as basically using AI to actually model a side of the system we've never been able to really handle very well before, basically, because the prediction of housing is potentially very problematic, and it's of course very topical at the moment. The housing affordability crisis everywhere around the world, basically, is key to this in sense. So we need new models of housing supply, basically, in this particular context, and this is what we're doing in this particular context here. Okay, one of the interesting things is that there are a number of systems out there where you could take a picture. I'm showing the picture of Oxfordshire with these little dots here on the left, and you can throw it into various products such as the Google Lens, etc., and it will search for similar images on the web, basically, in some sense. And to some extent, these images have nothing at all to do with one another, basically, but they're similar in that sense. And to some extent, that really, again, shows one of the things about artificial intelligence, searching for pattern where we might not expect it or where we might expect it in this sense, and then making sense of it, really, in that sense. Okay, well, to some extent, what we're showing here, or what I'm implying, is that in terms of AI and our methods for making predictions about the world, then in some senses, AI enables us to put theory-driven and data-driven models together. So it's an extension of our sets of tools that might relate to thinking about land use and housing and so on in that sense. And the patterns, of course, can be extracted from the patterns that can be extracted from the machine learning give us a sense of how we're trying to make sense of things in this particular context. So where do we go from here? Now, I've talked long enough, really, so let me wind it down, basically. There was a very famous paper written in the 1970s by Aaron Waldavsky, who was a professor of public policy at Berkeley, I think. And Waldavsky wrote this paper in Policy Sciences called "If Planning is Everything, Maybe It's Nothing." And we can probably say the same about AI. If AI is everything, maybe it's nothing. Or we can also say if AI is everywhere, maybe it's nowhere. And we're really sort of saying that it's so all embracing these ideas, they get in everywhere, that in some senses, it's probably wrong to think of AI as being a particular model or technique. It's more a way of thinking about the world in this particular context. And I think what we're going to come and what is going to happen is that AI is really going to become really part of the furniture. It's really part of the background, really, in some sense. Increasingly, largely because there's no template for how we might apply AI to lots of different things, basically, in a sense. And so really it's everywhere in that sense. The other feature, of course, is that just as computers are beginning to become part of the fabric of how we model the city, in a sense of how we exist in the city, then AI is also enabling us to develop real systems that use AI. So, for example, autonomous cars obviously depend on AI, but of course, if we're making predictions about traffic in towns, then we're making predictions using AI for those same autonomous cars in that sense. There is a circularity in all of this, which is important in terms of thinking about what kind of science that we might develop in that sense. So thanks very much for listening to what I've got to say. There's an awful lot in this, I know, in that sense, and I'm not absolutely sure that that I've quite hit the mark in terms of your focus on housing per se, but I've given you some idea of what I think's going on in AI, basically. I've written about this over a number of years, basically. So my New Science of Cities book and Inventing Future Cities, and then The Computable City are some books that I've written in the last 10 years that deal with all of this sort of stuff, basically, in a sense. And I'll leave you with the article, The Evolution of AI in City Planning, which covers a little bit of what I've been saying, I think, if you want to actually get some more information in terms of this sort of thinking. Thank you very much, and I'm going to return to our host.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that insightful keynote, which is a perfect scene setting with really a broad, long-ranging overview of not only what's happening in the housing sector, but where it is coming from. And this is raising really so many questions that I am burning to ask, but I am also mindful of the time. So we're going to go over these questions in the course of the discussion, to which your introduction brings very naturally. We will move from the broad perspective to how the applications are developing in the housing sector, how it is being rolled out now. And we are very fortunate to have a panel that reflects the full housing value chain. We are going to hear perspectives from the market, from regional policy and development factor frameworks, from innovation to design to implementation. So as we go into the discussion, I would encourage you panelists to ground the discussion as much as possible into concrete examples that you have been participating in, that you have witnessed as well. And so each panelist is going to speak for 10 minutes, really maximum, please, so that we keep the time, and I will be the watchdog for this. And then we will have a dialogue among you. So we're going to have as our first panelist, Bruno Lana. We're very pleased to have you here, Bruno. You're Associate Economic Affairs Officers at ECLAC, and you are bringing a regional development perspective to this discussion, focusing on how artificial intelligence can be applied to housing and urban policy in Latin America and the Caribbean. So could you please tell us about what are realistic entry points for adopting AI in the context of the region with its particularities and its constraints in relation in particular with informality, inequality, and the data challenges that are there? And about this, any hints you can provide, insights on the usefulness of the platform on housing and urban intelligence that has been developed by the IDB ECLAC with the support of the OECD will be very welcome. Bruno, over to you.
Thank you, Boris. Thank you very much, everyone, for the invitation. I'm sharing a presentation that tries to answer most of the questions. Just a second. I'm talking about how housing data in urban policy in the Latin America and the Caribbean are being shaped and are using AI now and in the near future. So I think the main question we can ask here is why Latin America demands better housing data and in that sense, the use of AI. First of all, of course, because we have an enormous housing deficit and demand far exceeds what the traditional responses could do so far. We are also having an increasing climate risk with cities facing floods, droughts, extreme heat. And in the face of climate emergencies, real-time responses are urgently needed and the change of scenarios and conditions are immediate. So you have to adapt quick the processes and policies to that. We also are a region with a lot of informality, and data gaps. So even when we have good data sources of official information of the formal market, we still have a lot of urban activity that's happening outside formal records, and we need to use intelligence and artificial intelligence to try to process data in a different way and generate some proxies or in different outputs for us. And of course, our condition in all countries, but of fiscal constraints, we need to be more productive with less resources, and AI can help in a smart prioritization and higher impact with lower resources. So where can AI transform housing systems in Latin America? We could maybe have four main cases, even though we could have much more if we keep talking about it. As I said, informality and land management, we can, through, for example, the use of satellite images that are interpreted and processed by AI, identify the informal neighborhoods, the vacant or underused land and buildings, and support land regularization and urban renewal. Also, it can be a tool to target housing deficit and targeting by integrated administrative data, surveys, geospatial data, everything that a government has to identify the priorities for policy and to allocate subsidies and programs. Climate risk, as I said, and then it's applied on mapping exposure, floods, heat, landslides at neighborhood level, and defining using the Markov-Sendai logic, where are the zones of risk for disasters. And also there's a good potential in regulatory and market intelligence. For example, AI can read out the zoning and building codes that in some cities are of enormous bureaucracy that a human being has a lot of difficulty to process and understand, and identify what is blocking development of housing, affordability of housing, and also monitoring land and housing market dynamics in real price. As Boris mentioned, we, the IDB with ECLAC and the support of OECD, we developed the Housing and Urban Intelligence Platform, which is integrated housing and urban data hub that consolidates more than 3,000 harmonized indicators across the region of interest for housing. And you can have make consultations by country, make regional comparisons, seeing some risk instruments, and it's also has country profiles. And among the sources, one of the main ones is Cepalistat from ECLAC, which is our main contribution, is the data that we already gather regularly. But the aim of this platform is to put this all together and making something that has more sense to a policymaker. So it was designed for governments, so to help them define and refine urban housing strategies, for researchers, where they will find all data in the same portal, and for civil society and the private sector. And we have been recently discussing exactly what are the next steps of this platform and how can we incorporate AI tools to improve it. And the main potentials that we were discussing is having a smarter search that will consolidate all this information together. And as a user, you can just ask questions on what you need, and it will look in the data to give you an answer. Something that the part on informal settlement mapping that I have been mentioning, the IDB has already made some pilots with the MAII, which is a satellite imagery used to identify informal neighborhoods. This was applied in some pilot cities, but the methodology itself, it can be just used across the region. It's a general methodology, so this is something with a lot of potential. Also, better housing deficit estimations. We now depend a lot on census and official data or housing surveys, but there's a lot of all those 3,000 indicators that are there. They could maybe help us refine and make better estimations, as well as urban growth simulations. So from all this, in the end, maybe I don't want to repeat myself too much, and we are trying to make it short on time, but the idea of this all is combining all those sources of information, which is so fragmented, into something that is integrated intelligence. And from having a static policy to adaptive policy that reacts in real time to different scenarios, as I said, climate risks, or to new policies that are being implemented. And sorry, I can see. And from projects to system governance, also have the AI embedded in ministries, in all levels of government, in all type of policies. Of course, there's a lot of risks associated with AI and governance. Some that I can mention here. There are many, but of course I chose four. With algorithms that are biased in access to credit, subsidies, and urban services, because AI is trained by what has been done so far in many cases. So if some parts of the population were excluded from programs, from credits, for example, they will continue to be classified as non-available for them if you use just the AI. So it has an impact on digital exclusion of informal communities which do not have connectivity or are not part of the data that's being generated. Also, there is a fine line between being in a smart city and having mass surveillance. As I said, the mapping of informal settlements is based on imagery that is trying to see if houses are constructing more in the land or having a higher level on real time. So it's a very fine line on how each citizen is not just a piece of data that's all the time being reported to official governments, and how this data is being used. And of course, the technological dependency on foreign models and platforms. We trust AI, but we, as users or policymakers, may not really know how it was trained, what is behind them. So its policy responses, we should have regulatory frameworks with focus on sovereignty and privacy, algorithm audits before deployment in public services, institutional capacity building across all levels of governments, and especially South-South regional cooperation also, because many AI models are based on data and information on the global north. and this has to be adjusted to the reality of our region. Some additional questions for public policy that are important to make is accountability. What happens when the algorithm decision gives an answer that is wrong or not good, or has at least a negative political impact? Who is accountable for that? Can we just blame the model, or who is the human person who is assuming the responsibility? Equity risks, as I said before, the targeting, can AI-driven targeting of subsidies reproduce existing discrimination if training data reflects past inequality? Also trade-offs, for example, between fairness and efficiency when you are implementing AI as a decision tool. Oversight capacity, also, as I said, how can we policymakers or governments monitor the black box of AI systems that we are implementing? And market risks, because the algorithm tools may be very helpful for us in policymakers to have a better response, but it can also be used to, for example, reduce competition in housing markets or increase prices. There is a case that has been studied, for example, of a platform of rentals in the US, where the algorithm of this platform was helping the landlords coordinate to increase prices. This was the goal of the platform, because if the prices are higher, the landlords will be interested in being on that platform, they will have a higher commission and so on. But this is not maybe society desire to have this kind of coordination, at least not just on the side of the landlords. So there's a lot of stuff that is going on at the same time and evolving very fast. And as a matter, I've tried to finish it right now because we are already on time, but this is basically the last slide. So how to escalate AI solutions in housing and urban planning. So as a proposal, it can start with the inventory of available resources, identifying gaps, establishing interoperability standards, and processing this data with intelligence, applying that on a focused pilot to measure impact and learn, have an institutional validation of what is being done, the process that's being done, how it's being done, and the ethical and legal framework very well defined. And then, of course, integrate that into national systems, having a scale and systematization. So to finish and conclude that, AI has an enormous transformative potential for our region, especially on housing, but only if we adapt it to our reality. It can fill the data gaps, enrich places and population that the state has been difficulty to reach now. We must prioritize that this is applied as a system level impact, not as an isolated tool. It's important to build governance and public purpose from the start. And regional platforms such as the one we are developing with the IDB and with the OCDE can accelerate that learning and cooperation, but the transformation depends on how governments are using, adopting, and governing AI. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruno, for this view on the Latin American and Caribbean region and all the insights. We are now moving forward with Antonella Guidocchio, who is Senior Director of Product at XCG. Yes, Antonella, your intervention will bring us a product and implementation perspective. You are concretely leading projects that contribute to what is called civic technology. And there, the question of ensuring that users are at the center and that the systems are serving them is really key. So your remarks are going to emphasize how important it is that the tools are transformed into instruments that are accessible, trustworthy, and that the users can put to their service, including users that are often underserved or even excluded from formal housing systems. So please tell us how this can be implemented, not only technically, but also as a way of serving the needs of users through co-design and co-implementation with them. Please, over to you, Antonella.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. So what I would like to cover today is the process that we needed to adapt, as well as an experiment we did to implement Gen AI in a responsible way in affordable housing. So hopefully we will give you confidence that is worth experimenting, and some inspiration and ideas on like how to do that in a responsible way, putting users at the center. First, a quick overview on like the work we do. We build technology exclusively for government agencies and nonprofits. On affordable housing, we have an open source platform that comprises 3 products. Basically, we build housing portals for different cities, counties, and states in the US. We simplify the search and application process. We also make it very easy for developers and property managers to list these units and for housing staff to make more informed decisions. We started this work with the city and county of San Francisco and then decided to open source the platform to be able to offer it in a more affordable and cost-effective way to different government agencies. And we have been expanding since then to different cities and counties, including some of them, the city of Detroit, the city of San Jose, and now we are about to launch a portal for the city of Los Angeles, among others. Here is just one snapshot of like how we localize the experience to make it very easy and consistent for people to apply. We are very proud to say that in each city where we work and we partner with government agencies, we are able to reduce the search and application process for affordable units from weeks to just 5 minutes, and people can do it from their phone and in their language of preference. Those are some of the features that I just wanted to highlight, but for the sake of time, I'll continue here. So I feel we are all very aware of like common responsible AI principles: fairness, accountability, reliability, transparency, privacy. But when we are building for marginalized communities, which we know many times they are experiencing trauma, they experience racism, they have very limited access to internet, we really need to take a step back and a different lens on how we build new functionality for them, and more so functionality like AI that can impose even bigger risk or create bigger exclusion gaps. So it's super important here to being intentional. So we have created a very proactive approach to rethink how we build products and functionality with the different government agencies that we work with. So just to highlight at least 3 of the principles, and then I will show concrete examples on the application of those. I think many of the other speakers also mentioned the biases that exist in housing data. So it's really important to make sure that we are augmenting our data, and user research, interviews with the people, conversations with people in need can go a really long way to really see what else is missing and how to focus on the edge cases. The other thing is always keeping humans in control, making sure that we are bringing empathy where is most needed, and augmenting on the steps that create more friction and where actually AI can be a really good tool to actually automate or like do the heavy lift, but always keeping housing staff or the humans, sometimes it can be developers and property managers, at the center of reviewing that information and making determinations or decisions. And then the third component, which I'll speak more of, is designing from the very beginning the use cases with the different stakeholders of the community. And by designing, I mean, first, we need to define what the real problems are. So co-designing with the community is not just saying, hey, this is the solution, do you have any feedback for us? But it's discussing together what are the problems, why are the root causes, and how can we bring a solution that will bring meaningful progress. So for instance, what we did, I think many people might be familiar with human-centered design and the design thinking process in product development. And what we did was like adjusted. So for instance, one of the steps that we added at the very beginning is like the framing phase, making sure that we are checking if AI is needed and if it will add meaningful value. The other one is assigning an ethical champion in our team to make sure that we are checking on all the different guardrails that we identify as essential. And then the other one is like working with the community from day one. And a key step there is like trust building with the technology. I feel like one of the things that is very important when we are working with AI use cases is making sure that we are creating spaces for people to learn about the capabilities and the risks that AI can bring to projects or to products. So for instance, we organize AI co-design sprint with key stakeholders of the affordable housing ecosystem in the Bay Area with philanthropic funding and in partnership with the Council of Government in the Bay Area on housing. It was 2 days event where like we again started by focusing on the education on the AI capabilities and then diving into the key problems and ask people to prioritize problems and define solutions. So based off that, we decided to focus on reporting. As Bruno was mentioning, unfortunately, in the housing ecosystem, data is very fragmented. There are a lot of like programs across local, state, and federal. It's very hard for housing staff to make sense of that data as well as to report on that data. And a lot of time is spent on that. And actually, the decisions that are made are not really the ones that are serving the community the most or that are very aligned with the needs of the community. We have seen a lot of gaps between what are the biggest needs in the community and what government housing departments are funding in terms of units. Okay, I'll skip some slides for the sake of time. So the solution that we end up building, it's called the Data Explorer. Basically, we show a dashboard with different charts and graphs. We allow for custom filtering so housing staff can decide what is kind of the most relevant data for them. And then we created an opt-in AI interface. Key considerations here in terms of guidelines. One is very important to add disclaimers and ask for feedback to, in this case, housing staff, as well as allowing them to opt out if they decide that the insights might not be valuable. We also, like when we were debating which use cases to prioritize first, there was a big debate across stakeholders from different sectors, but we decided to also focus on a use case that allow us to have a lot of human oversight. I think it's important to start small, but in a meaningful way. The other thing that was critical, it was actually building a strong partnerships with the legal departments. We had to put a lot of work into anonymizing data, making sure that we are cleaning and augmenting the data in the right ways. So that partnership at some moments in the project was like a big blocker, and then it really like made the product more robust. And then, of course, there was a temptation of like, let's integrate with a lot of data sources. And then we realized that could introduce a lot of risks. So better to have small data that is really valuable and high quality than start introducing too many unknowns or way too long to clean all the data possible before we launch functionality that can be useful for different users. So I mentioned how important it is to anonymize data. Then we label all the AI-generated content in a very clear way because it's really important that people understand and opt in like the implications of like the things they need to check. And then users always have the opportunity to provide feedback so we can learn and retrain the model or make adjustments is needed. And of course, AI is not making any decisions. These are just recommendations that then, in this case, housing staff needs to review. And we are introducing a lot of like prompts to actually encourage the user to review everything that is generated. We also isolated these Gen AI insights so there is no confusion and the users can really understand what is like real coming from the real data and what is like just generated by the AI. We also provide templates, which kind of makes the experience easy, also for housing staff in this case. Here are a few screenshots. What we decided to do is introduce some tables. So AI is not generating from anything possible, it's generating from the data that the user decides to actually select first. And then, as you can see here, we make it very clear if they want to opt in to generate AI insights, and then what are the implications of that. And then there is the narrative, which we improve upon feedback. This is a quote from one of our government partners, which I really appreciated. They were very sincere and honest throughout the process, that they were very concerned and somehow skeptics at some point, but that experimenting with AI has been really valuable for them and make them realize that it can not only bring efficiencies and give time back to housing staff to do more meaningful things and make better decisions, but also it can bring a cultural change in the ecosystem. Maybe, yeah, the one thing, the last reflection I would like to leave us with is how important it is to start experimenting. I think like we can plan a lot and create the best frameworks, but until we start like with one use case and experimenting, we won't really learn as much as like what are all the possibilities. And then it's very important to define the right success metrics. I think learning and building trust is the priority, and then speed and efficiency will come along. I can stop here. Thank you so much. And then I'll leave my contact details if anyone wants to continue the conversation. I feel like having honest dialogues across peers and sharing lessons learned is also very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonella, for the view and the concrete experiences, including the screenshots, which give really a feel of what is going on here. And with this, we are moving forward to Ed Atkins, who is a principal architect at Cove. So, Ed, you're going to bring us a practical perspective on how artificial intelligence is being used in architecture, more broadly in real estate development. So, at Cove, you are using AI throughout the life cycle of a project, and we are really keen to hear about this. And to know more about what it brings you at the various stages and along the different dimensions of not only efficiency, but also getting better outcomes from the architectural and design process. So over to you, Ed.
Thank you so much, Boris. I want to just mention, like, the introduction with the keynote from Michael made me think of something that I wanted to add, which is kind of a reference point that's really critical for our practice, where we're trying to acquire and utilize knowledge in the service of quality and make sure that we maintain that focus. And that comes from the McClamey curve and the building information modeling emergence in architecture, where BIM and the McClamey curve basically is an outline that maps design, effort, and cost relationships in the process of delivering an architectural project. The advent of Revit and other tools that we use within the production of buildings, once we had building information modeling and the sheer amount of information and data at our fingertips that was possible, it opens up this possibility within the process to be much more efficient early on and to level decisions early in the process that are going to have a massive impact in terms of quality and design effectiveness through our practice. So I just want to set the tone with that, because it really resonated with me mentally in terms of my own history and education within architecture, and that space of design, effort, and cost that's being leveraged. My own history is in urban infill, adaptive reuse, multifamily housing as well in North America. and basically looking at the design decisions that are made, every line we draw, and how important it is that we consider that every line we draw has a real tangible impact on the earth and on the environment and ecosystems. I've held that passion all the way through. Cove started, our company Cove Architecture started with analysis tool, load modeling tools, and basically looking at large language models and how we could take the history of analysis through multiple building types and typologies, look at all of the data that's out there for energy use within those occupancies, and then leverage that so designers could have insight into their own designs. We're now internalizing that and using it as a proprietary system within our design process, that we never lose sight of what we are able to be aware of in our process of design. So I want to touch on two major things like that we're really focused on at Cove, which is kind of an ontological approach where we're looking at the nature of practice and also the classification of practice, how we organize the act of architecture. I think that's extremely important at this time when you could be distracted by or derailed by the sheer amount of information related to our practice, or led astray by tools that might pull from other sources, not inherent to your own practice, that would influence your design direction, influence your programming approach. To do that, we're trying to put some guardrails around the universal and particular aspects of practice and make sure that we are staying focused on that. We've organized basically in this idea of generation, which is rapidly producing options with hard constraints around them, then evaluating those options, basically scoring them against objective criteria. And I'll mention in a moment what some of those criteria are that we've uploaded into our own kind of environment. Refining and optimizing those best candidates that have been evaluated to be at the highest level, and then interacting with them. And this is the most important part, this idea of interaction. That's the human in the loop with AI, which is so critical. Myself, I have over 30 years of experience within architectural practice. So bringing that knowledge base in and practical experience within building types is extremely important for any firm that may, easily overlook the value of the individuals within their practice and what they bring in terms of an editing and a value add to the process. Some of the documents, just to talk about some of the objectives we score against. Edward White's site analysis and methodology, basically uploading documents from Edward White's site constraints, 12 categories, and using those as physical, legal, and environmental constraints and evaluation tools. We looked at Christopher Alexander's pattern language and the 253 research-based patterns that were documented in a pattern language. And that has a direct tie-in with how we manage data and how Michael was discussing kind of distilling data into its essence, an attempt to put architecture into that same pattern and properly understand it. And then Clark and Paul's, their formal analysis and organizational principles from precedents in architecture. So looking at architecture that's come before us and what are the key principles that we can evaluate our own work against. So those are the three primary bodies of design evidence that we have integrated into our own internal proprietary system. I'll give you three examples in practice of how this plays out, because we also, of course, integrate current market data, which includes material costs, labor costs, depending on the region within which we're practicing for whatever project we may have at hand. The three examples in practice, the first would be pricing awareness and agility, the ability to substitute structure within our drawing platform. If we have to move from a wood construction to steel, move from concrete to heavy timber, making those decisions typically would involve quite a bit of time. So having it a structural engineer in-house, that human in the loop, but then also having the ability within our platform to substitute based on market conditions as we go through the process is something that I've never been able to experience before, but we're allowed to do at this point. We bring forward this idea of pricing awareness from the initial site being introduced to us from the client. We get their needs in terms of return on investment. And this minimizes the number of schemes we actually have to draw. So it adds to our efficiency and our dialogue with the client. So within affordable housing, there are multiple constraints in the US based on financing, materiality, and how the execution of that building is performed. And that's where we get direct feedback loops for pricing that we can inform decisions and narrow down a scheme much faster. The second out of the three is project dependencies and coordination. And that's where we can look at performance over time. Within affordable housing, the operational costs, the energy burden through the life cycle of a building is extremely important because it equates directly to cost out of pocket for the individual living in these homes who are below an area median income. And so we have to make sure that these projects are ethically responding to their origin and to their need for being in that affordable landscape, and making sure that that cost of operation is considered because housing is personal. And then the last would be the rapid testing for variables where dimensions, materiality, atmosphere is studied in architecture. And you have to have a feedback loop back into the system. It cannot be a completely data-driven response. I've heard many people say, the best building is one that humans don't occupy because there's no variation in use. If you have no windows, no doors, and a complete enclosure, then you can engineer a perfect system that's going to be ecologically sensitive. But in a way, it's useless. It's not engaging with the human condition and the nature of life. And so by keeping this idea of all of the variables that communities, that regulatory agencies, that cost and material and labor bring, being flexible and agile is one of the most exciting things coming out of this integration of AI and data sources into the design environment. And so I'd just leave you with the fact that through our ontological approach, we're really looking at the nature of practice and the classification of practice, but we're interested in how it's both an informational science so that we have structure and order, but it's also the social science where we have interpretation and values being embedded in the process. And like anyone, we're still working through this, but this is all in service to quality because we want an atmosphere that is beneficial to the human, especially in housing and especially in affordable housing. I think these ethics of living and the quality of the spaces we create are critical. And one of my favorite authors, Aldo Leopold, wrote, I think it's in the Sand County Almanac, about his land ethic. But he talks about the tools we use, if they remove us so far from the impact we create, we have to take a lot of care and we have to use a lot of caution. And so I wanted to just end with that and just state that condition of how we deal with the land and the environment relates directly to every one of our practices, and especially when AI is the tool that is being integrated in everything.
Thank you very much, Ed, for your presentation, also for this cautionary note for us to reflect. I'm going to get back to you with a question ready for follow-ups for, say, 2 minutes each, so that we save time for the next interventions. And Bruno, in a region, what would you think are really the very first priorities that governments should address to make sure that the potential of AI to improve the housing sector can be used as fast as possible? Where should they start?
Hi, Boris. Well, I think it should start by first understanding what data do we have now. I think the region has a lot of data that is already produced, is spread across organisms of the state. Many of them, for example, are considered administrative data that is not open to public or not even open to other public institutions. So there is a lot of lack of information supposedly on the value of properties or how many buildings that are in the city, where are they located? And they are somewhere, sometimes in the Texas institution or in the urban planning, but this is not well integrated. I think this is the main priority. And on a similar level, how to incorporate informality. We know that in some cities of Latin America, the majority of the constructions are made out of the norms. So how do we register their presence, or how do we have some control on what is being done and produced in the informal sector, and how do we incorporate this in public policies? I would mention this as the main priorities of the region.
Thank you very much, Bruno. And it's essentially the same question, Antonella, that I would like to ask you, because you showed us really the strong possibilities that are offered by the tools. Again, I was struck by the screen captures you showed. At the same time, you cautioned us against the trade-off between having a lot of data, but also having good data. But I don't want to preclude your answer. Yeah, what are the areas where the strongest investments should be done in the coming months, coming year, to get the better benefits for ultimately the beneficiaries, the people eligible, people who need affordable housing?
I think it's critical to make sure that we are connecting the data with the real needs of people. For instance, in our case, we are trying to help housing directors, housing staff to make use of the data and make more informed decisions. And what we are seeing, for instance, an example that I was mentioning is that a lot of funding is going to fund units that are 2 bedrooms or 3 bedrooms. But when we bring the most requested units in the different communities, we are seeing a big gap in units for very low income people, and also that the most requested unit types are studios or 1 bedroom. But housing staff don't really have the data to understand that, or they learn about that later when they already made huge investments. So it's really important to augment the data that we are having with the experience in real people, and then really have ceremonies where we are reviewing all that data, because sometimes we want more data and interoperability, and we are governments are not really making use of the data that they have in hand. And with this tool, what we try to make is that the reporting easier and more at hands of housing staff.
Thank you very much, Antonella. And Ed, you touched on many issues, and I'd like to bounce back on one when you highlighted that it's become possible now, once the design of a project is underway, to reconsider the choice and say between steel, concrete, wood for the structure. That really impressed me, because that was, my understanding is that something like 20 years ago, it was really a decision you had to make early on and then live by, and that was it. And now, if understood correctly, even when the design is already started, you can reconsider this, adapt to market conditions or to demand. This sounds extremely promising. I mean, it's fascinating from this design project, but also if I take the view of an economist, we have not had in the housing sector productivity growth. It's one of the very few sectors in the private part of the economy where there's been no improvement in productivity over the past 25 years, essentially since the beginning of the century, with very few exceptions across countries, even some where it has gone down. But this harbors the promise of increases in productivity, which in the end translate into lower costs, greater affordability, stronger inclusion, if everything goes right. So I wanted to ask you if you could tell us a bit more about that, and if you share that optimism that I derived from the insight you gave.
There's optimism, but again, we're a very old industry, architecture. So I think Room Koolhaas said once, it was we have one toe. It's a delicate dance we're doing. We have this toe in history, and then we have this toe in the future, and we're trying to balance between the two. And I think no better words have been said to describe that effort. I would go back to the McClamey curve that Patrick McClamey created in 2012, because this idea of substituting the structure, yeah, that's only effective, up to a point within the process. So there's still this legitimacy and truth to that original idea that these design effort and cost decisions have made early on are most effective to a project and to the delivery of a project and to the proficiency of a design team and a construction team. However, now that we have, let's say, a 3D model, a virtual model of our building that is contextually aware or codependent upon each component, modifying certain structural elements, of course, will impact our ADA clearances, our the atmosphere we're trying to create in particular spaces, everything. It touches everything. But being able to substitute quickly and have the building adjust within the virtual realm so that we can then evaluate and discern what the major impacts are, communicate those effectively through standard drawing protocol sharing to our consultants. That ability to do that quickly and in reference to a holistic system versus, I'm going to look at what that does to our lobby or what it does to our facade system. Instead of just looking at the particular, looking at the holistic building through a massive change like that. That's why I mentioned that change, is because a structural change is a massive change, but what does it then impact? It impacts your civil, your foundational systems. It'll impact definitely your carbon profile for your building. So there might be, a host of issues why this could occur and has occurred to many of us throughout our process of design. But instead of having fear towards it, I'm a very optimistic person, but I continue to have optimism that this ability to study it quickly and to highlight and immediately have highlighted in your model in red on your screen the impacts that it has caused allows you to have an immediate, rapid feedback loop to the client, the jurisdiction, the evaluation agency, a third party, carbon agency, whoever is introducing this variation. You can have an informed conversation with data backing it up much faster than you could before. So that's where my optimism is that it enables us to be more informed when we entertain decisions and changes that naturally occur later in that process of design.
Thank you very much. Really, I'm very grateful to all your interventions. Big thanks. And we are now moving to where all of this is happening, to the cities. That's where all the streams of discussion we've had so far are joining together. And we are pleased to have Gabriel Minan, who heads the Bogota City Lab at the District Planning Secretariat in Bogota. Gabriel, in your intervention, you are bringing a public sector and city level perspective. Please tell us about how digital tools, emerging technologies are being integrated into the urban planning and housing systems of Bogota. How are you experimenting with the use of the newly available data that you have at hand? How concretely are you improving planning processes and re-engineering decision-making and then the delivery of housing services in your city? Please, over to you, Gabriel.
Muchas gracias, Boris. Buenos días a
Oh,
todos.
yes, sorry, I forgot to say that, you're going to speak in Spanish, and that for people like me who listen in English, there is interpretation that is embedded into the system. So at the bottom of the Zoom screen, you have either directly the interpretation button, or you click more and you find a button for interpretation. Thank you. Sorry for the interruption, Gabriel, and again, over to you.
No hay ningún problema. Buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Ha sido, creo que muy provechoso todo lo que los colegas han mostrado hasta el momento de las distintas ciudades, de lo que se está haciendo en distintas partes del mundo. Yo les voy a mostrar un caso que venimos trabajando desde la ciudad de Bogotá. Para quienes no tienen contexto, ya les voy a compartir pantalla para mostrarles la información. Pero Bogotá es la capital de Colombia, tiene aproximadamente 8 millones de personas y solo en área tenemos más de 160.000 hectáreas entre zona urbana y rural, y solo en la parte urbana tenemos 40.000 hectáreas. Entonces es una ciudad gigante, es un reto gigante para nosotros, el poder gestionar todo lo que demanda la ciudad, y para eso algunas cosas de las que comentaban mis compañeros panelistas, a nosotros nos toca encargarnos constantemente de poder responder a lo que la ciudadanía demanda, pero eso implica que no podemos gastarnos el tiempo en, en generar los datos, en todo este procesamiento que implica todo lo que queremos saber de la ciudad, y necesitamos es tener los insumos para la toma de decisiones para poder responder justamente a las demandas de ciudad. En Bogotá nosotros funcionamos, tenemos un alcalde mayor y tenemos distintas entidades. No me voy a detener mucho en esto, después en la grabación seguramente quienes quieran profundizar lo pueden ver y lo podemos hablar, pero esta es la estructura de la Secretaría de Planeación y se las quería mostrar muy rápidamente porque la Secretaría de Planeación es completamente transversal a todo el distrito y al resto de entidades de la ciudad. Entonces nosotros tenemos una subsecretaría territorial, una subsecretaría de políticas públicas, una de inversión y una de información, y esto hace que nosotros hablemos con todas las entidades del distrito todo el tiempo. Nosotros hacemos parte del laboratorio de ciudad, que es una oficina asesora que trabaja temas de prospectiva territorial, pero acá hay cosas muy importantes, como el hecho, por ejemplo, de la Subsecretaría de Información, que tiene una dirección de cartografía, de estadística y de registros sociales. Nosotros también tenemos una página de datos abiertos en Bogotá. Acá más de 70 entidades, como lo dice acá, aportan a estos datos. Hay más de 2.000 conjuntos de datos actualmente, pero en planeación nosotros centralizamos toda la información. Entonces acá tenemos las bases de datos alfanuméricas y también geográficas, donde tenemos más de 1.000 entidades geográficas con las cuales podemos trabajar de información de toda la ciudad. Y les comento esto porque eso ya creo que es un paso en la gobernanza de la información, de la cual también han hablado mis compañeros, que nos permite realmente utilizar la información de manera muy eficiente para procesarla y tomar las decisiones. Nosotros en el laboratorio de ciudad, como les comentaba, somos una oficina asesora, que la manera en la cual funcionamos es que nosotros acompañamos a todas las dependencias del distrito de manera paralela, identificando oportunidades de mejora en la gestión de los procesos, de lo que se hace en la ciudad, pero también identificando esas señales de cambio, esos drivers of change que uno llama cuando habla de temas de prospectiva, para realmente tener mapeado qué nos toca atender de manera prioritaria en la ciudad. Y tenemos 3 líneas de trabajo donde en la gestión de conocimiento hablamos con todos los gobiernos locales y nacionales de distintas partes del mundo para saber también qué está pasando allá y tener herramientas para la innovación. La segunda es justamente una línea de innovación urbana y llevamos a cabo procesos de innovación pública abierta. Y la tercera es de prospectiva territorial, que es donde se enmarca un poco este ejercicio que les voy a mostrar, pero acá básicamente lo que hacemos es pensar en los futuros posibles y deseados de la ciudad. Entonces, en esto, en esta línea de perspectiva territorial tenemos una estrategia que se llama Bogotá Futuro. Esto va a sonar un poco romántico, pero me gusta siempre arrancar con esto porque hicimos un ejercicio no prospectivo, sino miramos hacia atrás los planes en los que Bogotá se había pensado a futuro, y el más antiguo es de 1923, hace casi 100 años. Y ese plan se llamaba Bogotá Futuro, como nuestra estrategia, y se pensaba Bogotá a 2045 con 800.000 personas y 6.000 hectáreas. Faltan todavía 20 años para eso y ya somos más de 10 veces la cantidad de personas, y somos solo en el área urbana más de 6 veces el tamaño. Entonces, esto es como un recordatorio constante de lo que implica la planeación de una ciudad, Esto no quiere decir que no debamos pensar a futuro, al contrario, debemos tener muy clara la ciudad que queremos, pero debemos ser muy rigurosos en las tomas de decisiones y en el ejercicio que se hace en el día a día en la planeación urbana. Ahorita nosotros estamos en un momento importante en Bogotá, un momento álgido y es una nueva realidad demográfica. Por primera vez en la historia de la ciudad, Bogotá se va a enfrentar a un decrecimiento poblacional. Esto no es simplemente una transición demográfica donde la población de adultos mayores crece y la de niños disminuye, sino vamos a comenzar a decrecer. Y esto que les estoy mostrando acá son tres proyecciones poblacionales de 2018, 2023 y 2025, que si ustedes se dan cuenta, la diferencia en años son 2, 3 años, 4 años, pero el cambio es gigante. Pasamos de tener en 2035, pensábamos en 2018 que íbamos a llegar a ser 8.7 millones de personas, y 5 años después, que tuvimos el COVID, que tuvimos unos picos migratorios importantes, la población que estimamos ahora es 7.8 millones de personas, casi un millón menos. Y esto también nos mostró que muy seguramente este año es cuando llegamos al punto máximo poblacional y desde el próximo año comenzamos a decrecer. Y esto genera unos cambios importantes en el territorio, en la toma de decisiones, en lo que hacemos. Y la transición demográfica, que acá es muy claro, estos son los dos censos que tenemos de 2005-2018, esto es proyección 2025-2035, pero la pirámide poblacional se nos está invirtiendo. eh, ya dentro de un par de años va a pasar a ser un rombo y después una pirámide invertida. Y entonces nosotros hemos sido muy rigurosos desde la Secretaría de Planeación de poder generar insumos que nos permitan tomar decisiones de manera oportuna. Este diagrama es muy gráfico, pero muestra muy bien las intenciones que nosotros tenemos con esta estrategia de Bogotá Futuro y no es simplemente un análisis de datos poblacional para saber si somos más o somos menos, sino que es todo lo que eso desencadena en las dinámicas urbanas de ciudad, en los temas de los hogares, de las viviendas, del espacio público, de cómo ocupamos el suelo, si renovamos o cogemos el suelo libre y también, por ejemplo, temas como la mano de obra que necesitamos, los servicios del cuidado que necesitamos, más adultos mayores demandan más servicios de salud y hay un desencadenamiento con esto. Y entonces estamos en esta línea, es como un paso más allá de la planeación urbana que conocemos normalmente, estamos pasando a la planeación prospectiva, donde nuestra finalidad es generar insumos y completamente datos muy rigurosos de distintos escenarios posibles para la toma de datos. El hecho de que uno pueda generar distintos escenarios hace que uno también prevea distintas cosas y que podamos ser una sociedad mucho más resiliente. Y es hacia donde le estamos apuntando. Ya enfocándonos en lo que trata este panel, todo lo que hemos hablado y lo que ustedes han comentado, inteligencia artificial, y qué estamos haciendo desde las ciudades, hay un ejercicio que nosotros llamamos potenciales y concreción de ciudad. Y les voy a mostrar un módulo específico, que es el módulo de oferta de vivienda. Algunos de ustedes antes en otras intervenciones hablaron justamente de eso. Y acá lo que nosotros comenzamos a hacer, una vez más, como nosotros somos una oficina asesora, nosotros no tomamos la decisión. Existe una Secretaría de Hábitat que toma todas las decisiones de vivienda. Pero lo que nosotros sí podemos hacer es darle esa mirada prospectiva y generarle los insumos necesarios para la toma de decisiones. Entonces, lo que les voy a mostrar a continuación es el procedimiento que nosotros implementamos, los algoritmos, para generar los escenarios, pero este diagrama muestra muy bien qué es lo que vamos a ver. Entonces, hagan de cuenta que, por ejemplo, hoy en día existe una casa de 3 pisos y la norma urbana en nuestro plan de ordenamiento territorial permite hacer hasta 9 pisos porque está en una zona de renovación urbana, tiene al frente, por ejemplo, una vía arterial, pero esto no implica que uno realmente pueda construir eso porque existen otros factores urbanísticos como por ejemplo las redes de acueducto que a uno le dicen, oiga, uno puede construir por norma 9 pisos, pero la capacidad hídrica nos da para 5 pisos. Y luego llegan el mercado y dice, muy chévere los 5 y los 9 pisos, pero el mercado solo me va a absorber 4. Y entonces quedo en este último escenario. Y esto solo es negocio si realmente esto es una casa de 3 pisos y yo paso a tener 4 pisos con 8 apartamentos, pero si acá ya hay 6 apartamentos, de pronto no es negocio. Y esto no se termina dando. Entonces nosotros montamos todo un proceso. Cuando el año pasado con mi equipo montamos esto, y como lo pueden leer acá, ya lo tenemos automatizado con algoritmos, jalamos los datos del día a día en tiempo real que vamos actualizando, porque este ejercicio nos tomaba más de un año poder realizarlo. Acá hay más de 90 variables incorporadas. y no tenemos tiempo todo un año para decir, oiga, la decisión que tomamos el año pasado realmente no era, pero ya nos quedamos cortos para la realidad. Entonces, lo primero que hicimos fue agarrar únicamente los lotes en suelo urbano, porque la ruralidad pues funciona de una manera distinta. Nosotros en Bogotá tenemos un total de 932.000 lotes y este ejercicio automatizado se corre para cada uno de esos lotes. Lo siguiente que hicimos fue limpiar esos lotes que realmente no funcionan para hacer vivienda. Entonces, no me voy a detener en cada variable, pero acá ustedes van a poder ver cuáles fueron esos lotes que fueron desapareciendo. Los parques metropolitanos, las plazas, la infraestructura del metro, que estamos ahorita teniendo nuestra primera línea de metro, todo lo que está en amenaza alta de riesgo no mitigable, grandes centros comerciales, patio talleres, universidades de alta educación y todo lo patrimonial, por ejemplo, y la estructura ecológica principal. Y eso nos deja solo un 77% de los lotes. Pero además miramos cuáles de esos lotes están dentro de unos ámbitos que ya tienen una norma o vienen avanzando, entonces al final quedamos con 73 lotes que pueden acoger vivienda. Luego miramos la altura que realmente se le permite a cada uno de esos lotes. Esto depende de algo que nosotros llamamos tratamientos urbanísticos, que creo que esto es muy latinoamericano, pero dice, este suelo se puede renovar, este suelo se puede desarrollar, este suelo se puede consolidar. La mayor parte de Bogotá ya está consolidada, que es todo esto azul, y lo naranja es lo de renovación urbana, para que lo tengan presente. Y con eso miramos entonces la cantidad de pisos que pueden tener. Entonces, esta zona de la ciudad, por ejemplo, tiene una mayor capacidad para desarrollar pisos que el resto de la ciudad, hasta 20 pisos, 25 pisos. Miramos la diferencia entre la cantidad de pisos que se pueden construir versus lo que ya existe hoy en día, que nosotros tenemos esa información, cuántos pisos están construidos, y miramos cuál es la diferencia, porque ese delta es realmente el potencial que va a permitir construir, y generamos un índice para ver, oiga, si ya existen 2 pisos y puedo construir 3, pues puedo subir un 30%, pero si son 2 pisos y puedo subir 8, ahí hay 6 pisos adicionales, pero si son 8 y ya tengo 7, pues no es negocio, entonces este índice nos permite justamente eso. Y finalmente entramos a calcular los escenarios. Entonces lo hacemos por cada uno de los tratamientos. Lo primero que hacemos es calcular el área de construcción que se puede desarrollar en cada uno de los lotes, y como esto es un ejemplo de vivienda, un prototipo de vivienda, entramos a restar en los escenarios la cantidad de viviendas construidas, si es por ejemplo renovación, porque esas son viviendas que se van a reemplazar, y el área construida en el caso de mejoramiento integral de barrios, que son casas que lo que hacen es construir pisos adicionales, muy en la periferia, producto de estos desarrollos que arrancan algunas veces de manera informal y que luego nosotros trabajamos como ciudad para formalizar. No voy a entrar en detalle y explicarles las fórmulas detrás de todo esto y los algoritmos, pero sí quiero resaltar este tipo de cosas. Y es que nosotros somos muy rigurosos en que este insumo no sea tan discrecional, sino que sea completamente basado en datos. Entonces, nosotros no decimos, oiga, para estos 100 lotes de la ciudad que pueden acoger vivienda, vamos a dividir por 45 metros cuadrados, que es el estándar de la vivienda de interés social, de la vivienda pública acá, sino que decimos, oiga, nosotros tenemos la ciudad dividida en 33 sectores y cogemos cada uno de esos sectores y por cada uno de los tratamientos, entonces si la mitad de un sector está en renovación urbana, calculamos qué tipo de producto inmobiliario se ha venido construyendo para que con ese mismo tamaño del producto inmobiliario veamos el mercado posiblemente cuántas viviendas va a generar. Entonces hay sectores de la ciudad donde generan viviendas de 70 metros cuadrados y sectores de la ciudad donde generan apartaestudios de 25 metros cuadrados. Y eso nos aproxima mucho a la realidad porque nos cambia realmente el cálculo cuando se hacen las operaciones basado en el deseo y no realmente en lo que está sucediendo en el mercado y en el territorio. Esto nos deja un escenario estos son los lotes que quedan con un potencial de vivienda, que pueden aportar por lo menos una vivienda o más en la ciudad, y solo nos queda el 12% de los lotes útiles. Y después calculamos la concreción de vivienda, y acá entran otras variables como la que les comentaba, de las redes de acueducto, la infraestructura de acueducto, de servicios públicos, que nos define también la capacidad del territorio. Y acá también hacemos unas operaciones donde identificamos si ha pasado algo o no en los últimos 10 años en cada barrio de la ciudad. Nosotros tenemos más de 1000 barrios en la ciudad. Entonces, si no se ha generado nada a niveles constructivos, Nosotros, por ejemplo, esto nos ayudó a identificar zonas de la ciudad que tienen muchos problemas de seguridad y que eso no ha permitido que se construya porque no es atractivo para el mercado. Zonas donde hay mucha reticencia por parte de la ciudadanía y que a pesar de que tengamos mucho potencial, lo que nos toca hacer es un trabajo social muy fuerte para construir ciudad entre ambas partes. Pero entonces esto también ya nos dice, oiga, yo tengo un escenario potencial de todo lo que podría desarrollar, pero este tipo de variables ya me aterrizan a lo que realmente puede que pase en los siguientes años, a través del mercado y con la capacidad del territorio. Eso nos deja solo un 4% de la totalidad de lotes de la ciudad. Si se dan cuenta, acá ya no está tan manchado. Hay unas zonas que tienen mucho potencial por desarrollar, otras desaparecen definitivamente. Y esto es un poco el resumen. Entonces, acá les quité como las cifras totales, pero del 100% de los lotes, queda un 12% de lotes útiles para el escenario potencial, un 4% para el escenario de concreción. Hay un potencial aproximado de 1.5 millones de viviendas. Lo que nosotros hemos calculado es que necesitamos solo 1 millón de viviendas de aquí al 2035, y esto nos deja un margen de saber dónde podemos ir y poner programas para mover también el mercado, pero ese 100% de las viviendas que se puede generar en toda la ciudad, solo se pueden concretar normativamente un 45% y tendencialmente un 31%. Esto de tendencialmente es mercado, que el mercado hace su tarea, identifica esos lotes con mayor oportunidad y lo va desarrollando. Y entonces, volviendo a esos escenarios posibles que les comentaba al inicio, eso que les acabo de mostrar genera estos 3 escenarios. Y nosotros disponemos esos escenarios posibles a la Secretaría de Hábitat para que genere un escenario de decisión de política pública que se va a mover entre estos mínimos y no nos puede, pues acá en Bogotá no vamos a decir, vamos a generar 5 pisos porque ya podemos decir que es que el mercado se va a encargar de esos 5 pisos, pero tampoco decimos que vamos a llegar a 15 pisos porque ya sabemos que la norma nos permite solo 9. Teniendo esto presente, nosotros también dimos un paso más allá. Hay gente que lee mapas, hay gente que sabe de datos, pero no todo el mundo tiene esas capacidades y generamos también herramientas para que la toma de decisiones sea mucho más eficiente. Entonces, mis compañeros también hablan en algún momento de los gemelos digitales. Y en Bogotá estamos implementando ahorita el gemelo digital. Ustedes pueden encontrar esto en línea, se llama Predio 360, y lo que ustedes ven acá, si se dan cuenta, hay unos polígonos, unos volúmenes blancos muy concretos, que esa es la ciudad construida. Pero también ustedes ven unos polígonos translúcidos, y nosotros podemos encender y apagar estas capas, y lo que podemos ver muy rápidamente es qué zonas de la ciudad tienen potencial, qué zonas no, pero además cómo quedaría la ciudad construida si generáramos, por ejemplo, el escenario potencial, que es todo lo que nos permite la norma. Y también nos permite ver, por ejemplo, qué manzanas podemos englobar para generar proyectos estratégicos de ciudad. Y esto es una herramienta, como les comento, que está abierta al público, que está online, que una entidad no necesita, o incluso los desarrolladores y constructores no necesitan buscarnos, sacar una cita, preguntarnos, sino que tienen la información a la mano y dispuesta para que puedan tomar las distintas decisiones. Ya estoy cerrando y con esto solo quiero contarles que eso que les acabo de mostrar de la oferta de vivienda es un piloto que hicimos el año pasado, pero este año vamos a ir un paso más allá, entonces estamos generando escenarios no solo de oferta, sino también de demanda de vivienda. Estamos generando escenarios de oferta y demanda de servicios sociales y del cuidado, y eso como se ve traducido en infraestructuras, es decir, equipamientos dotacionales, y también en cómo se consolidan los nodos económicos de la ciudad y cómo equilibramos esto, para no ir a decir, oiga, en el mismo lote voy a construir equipamiento, vivienda y comercio, sino este lote tiene mayor potencial de ser un dotacional y se destina principalmente para eso, y comenzamos a ver la ciudad que nos queda. Este ejercicio tuvo incidencia el año pasado a nivel nacional en la actualización, por ejemplo, de las proyecciones demográficas, a nivel regional, en un estudio de expansión urbana que se hizo, y a nivel local, en el distrito en Bogotá, en la actualización del Plan Maestro de Hábitat, que es el que define un poco y da esa línea a todo el distrito de dónde se debería priorizar la vivienda, bajo qué programas. También formulamos incentivos urbanísticos porque el distrito no lo puede hacer todo, el sector público no nos da abasto, y que el mercado también pueda dinamizarse y moverse mucho más. Y pasamos de un ejercicio en el que tardábamos un año, año y medio, a un ejercicio que lo corremos en 30 minutos, una vez al mes, y podemos entrar a ver y comparar, oiga, este suelo se ocupó y se ocupó con esto, y tenemos muy claro con qué se ocupó, pero también ese suelo que por algún motivo se desocupó, pasó a tener potencial y que podemos moverlo y ver las oportunidades ahí de la ciudad. Finalmente, ya con esto cierro, y es que Bogotá, al ser también la capital, tiene un montón de información. Nosotros ya hemos comenzado a montar, por ejemplo, maquetas con nubes de puntos, LiDAR, otro tipo de metodologías, de tecnologías de la ciudad para ser muy rigurosos y tener insumos para la toma de decisiones. Estamos avanzando mucho en esto y estamos dando justamente ese paso de que la planeación sea un proceso muy demorado, que realmente no va a tiempo, sino que la realidad va mucho más rápido, a que tengamos realmente una dinámica de toma de decisiones oportuna, que para eso es que nos sirve la tecnología. Hay que ser muy rigurosos en toda la base metodológica para montar todo esto, pero una vez logramos alcanzar estas herramientas, logramos realmente responderle a la ciudadanía con lo que se necesita y a la construcción de ciudad. Y eso es un poco lo que hemos venido haciendo acá en Bogotá. Perdón si me pasé un par de minutos. Espero que no haya sido mucho bombardeo de información.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. That was fascinating to go from the Bogota 1923 Futuro exercise to what is happening now, and really one thing that really stands out among many is say that these exercises that took 1.5 years to conduct can now be done in 30 minutes. I mean, that's the scale of progress and advances that we're looking at. And now we are turning to a country-level case with Felipe Yavar, who is a coordinator for territorial information system for housing demand at the Ministry of Housing and Urbanism of Chile. So Felipe, you will bring to all of us here a national level perspective on how these data systems that we just saw at the metropolitan area level, how they are transforming at the national level the way in which governments understand, plan, and respond to housing demand. So please, Felipe, over to you.
Thank you very much. My presentation is in Spanish. I'm going to do it in Spanish. I didn't know that it has to be in English, so maybe in the next time
it
I
is
prepare it.
Perfectly planned in Spanish and planned this way with interpretation. Huh? Yeah.
Okay. Bueno, mi nombre es Felipe Ayar, trabajo en el Ministerio de Vivienda y Urbanismo, la Oficina de Gestión de Proyectos Habitacionales, y junto a un equipo con el que trabajo estamos a cargo de Mimbu Conecta. Mimbu Conecta es un sistema de información territorial de la demanda habitacional que concentra todos los datos que nosotros levantamos de las familias y de las personas para poder caracterizarlas y definir cuál es el programa habitacional que más se adecua a su necesidad, cuando nos presenta la necesidad de compra, construcción, arriendo o mejoramiento de una vivienda. El Ministerio de Vivienda y Urbanismo, el 2010-2011, detectó que a partir de la entrega a terceros de la gestión habitacional a través de entidades patrocinantes estaba perdiendo el contacto y la organización de la demanda y la cercanía con la ciudadanía. Entonces, a partir de eso, intenta retomar una iniciativa que era muy antigua, que se llamaba Registro Único de Inscritos, donde las personas se inscribían en un listado y a partir de ese listado se iba haciendo una prelación de más o menos quién iba obteniendo un subsidio habitacional y una vivienda. Esto antes de que estuviéramos interconectados con distintos servicios. Por ejemplo, nosotros levantamos información del registro civil para saber si la persona está casada o no está casada, del registro social de hogares, que es nuestro sistema de caracterización social, donde sabemos el tamaño de su núcleo familiar, qué porcentaje de vulnerabilidad tiene la familia, también sabemos si la persona tiene alguna discapacidad, sabemos si tiene alguna propiedad, y además consultamos si esta persona ha postulado o no alguno de nuestros subsidios anteriormente, o si ya tiene una vivienda, lo vemos con servicio de impuesto interno. Entonces, toda esta caracterización nos permite ir modelando el tipo de demanda que tiene esta persona y recomendarle cuál es el programa habitacional que a ellos le conviene. Y esto lo hacemos hoy, lo estamos haciendo a través de mensajes, correos electrónicos destinados directamente a las familias, que esto es lo que llevamos haciendo hace algún tiempo. nuestro principal desafío tenía que ver con la consolidación de los datos. El ministerio tenía un problema de que cada programa nuevo que se generaba una nueva base de datos y un nuevo aplicativo para su postulación. Entonces teníamos tantas bases de datos como programas habitacionales. Entonces después, esas bases de datos las arma cada persona que este aplicativo, como ellos consideraban pertinente. Entonces después, cuando uno necesitaba unificar información, había muchas brechas, que no te respecto a lo que decía Bruno, teníamos que llevar muchos gaps de información. Entonces, armamos un proyecto para la consolidación de estos datos y eso nos permite hoy día establecer una nueva comunicación con las familias porque sabemos con mayor claridad en qué etapa del viaje del usuario están. En qué etapa están para poder darles una recomendación que les permita muchas veces salir de un círculo vicioso en el que entran por desinformación, por no entender bien qué programas habitacionales son los que están, cuáles son los requisitos que tienen y cuáles son los pasos que tienen que seguir. Entonces, nuestro objetivo es pasar de una comunicación reactiva, donde las personas tengan que pedir permiso en su trabajo, venir a nuestra oficina, preguntarle a algún ejecutivo qué tiene que hacer, después volver a su casa, en el fondo con un folleto donde anotó algo, y después de eso probablemente llega a su casa y recuerde la mitad de lo que le dijeron. Entonces, nosotros a través de esto estamos construyendo información que también estamos disponibilizando a las familias para que ellos también tengan la misma información que tenemos nosotros y parta la conversación desde 2 o 3 pisos más arriba de lo que podría partir anteriormente. Y además, esto lo tenemos organizado territorialmente y comunalmente. Entonces también tenemos información de la demanda local, el tipo de demanda, dónde están las mayores necesidades, etc. Este es el manual de visualización de datos. Hoy día tenemos 2.400.000 casi hoy de personas registradas, dependiendo de su necesidad habitacional, con un montón de información, distribución por edad, por caracterización socioeconómica, preferencia habitacional, si tiene alguna discapacidad, si pertenece a algún pueblo originario, si habitan en campamentos, en asentamientos informales, el estado civil y también la cantidad de integrantes que tienen estos núcleos familiares, que es súper importante porque al final es uno de los puntajes que más incide en la obtención o no de un beneficio habitacional. También tenemos la información individual de las personas que se registran individualmente, también como colectivamente. No sé, perdón. No. Mm. Ahí sí,
No, it's not there now. Now it's coming up. Yes. Thank you.
perdón. Bueno, eso es lo que les hablé antes. Y esto finalmente es nuestro panel de visualización que les estaba hablando recién. Voy a mostrarlo. Donde tenemos la organización de la demanda, tenemos filtros por región, por comuna, por preferencia habitacional, por estado, porque las personas se inscriben, después postulan, después pueden ser seleccionadas y después pueden aplicar ese beneficio. Entonces tenemos todos esos estados para hacer el seguimiento y, como les decía antes, saber en qué etapa de este viaje del usuario están, o saber qué mensaje o qué información les tenemos que entregar para que ellos puedan tomar una mejor decisión. También, como les decía recién, tenemos la información de las familias tanto desde la organización colectiva a la organización individual. Acá en el ministerio muchas personas postulan colectivamente a un programa que se llama Fondo Solidario de Elección de Vivienda, que les permite organizarse en un grupo, contactar a una entidad patrocinante, armar un proyecto, encontrar un terreno y construir un conjunto habitacional donde hayan todos ellos. Esas familias tienen que cumplir ciertos requisitos, entonces a partir de esta información también nosotros les podemos informar en qué etapa está su proyecto, porque eso nos permite también velar porque no ocurran malas prácticas muchas veces de ciertos dirigentes o de ciertos asesores que acompañan a estos grupos y que les cobran dinero para poder avanzar en estos proyectos. Entonces, en cada reunión les cobran una cuota y por antes pueden decir que no, si tenemos un terreno, no se preocupen, y jamás tuvieron ese terreno. Entonces, este proceso va democratizando el acceso a información por parte de todos los integrantes del comité para que ellos también estén en un escenario mejor a la hora de conversar o armar su proyecto ahí. Este es más o menos el promedio de integrantes por cada grupo, son cerca de 40, entre 40, hay grupos de 20 personas o hay grupos de 60 personas, entonces, pero ese es el promedio con el cual contamos. Y parte importante de lo que hacemos nosotros también es que conservamos durante 36 meses la calificación socioeconómica de las familias que están en el comité, porque el porcentaje de calificación socioeconómica es más bajo, es menos el ahorro que deben poner para el proyecto. Entonces, si finalmente cambian de tramo, por ejemplo, pocos meses antes de que empiece la postulación, les pueden pedir un montón más de dinero y esas familias, si no logran completar ese ahorro, quedan fuera del proyecto. Entonces, también le damos cierta estabilidad para que las personas tengan certeza de que van a poder llegar también al tramo final del proyecto y es un incentivo para que también se registren en la plataforma. Hoy tenemos 216 municipalidades con acceso a Mimbo Conecta, que también pueden registrar sus comités y pueden registrar la demanda individualmente. Esto es importante porque las municipalidades en Chile son la organización local más de la ciudadanía. Lo primero que hace un ciudadano cuando necesita alguna información, acude a la municipalidad, entonces nosotros le damos acceso a nuestra plataforma para que puedan ver toda la caracterización de esa persona y puedan darle una mejor recomendación. Y en caso de que la municipalidad organice algún grupo para que postule a un proyecto colectivo, también lo pueden cargar ellos en la plataforma y de esa manera se está conservando durante 36 meses la calificación socioeconómica de esa familia y le da cierta certeza de que el monto de ahorro que tienen que ahorrar es A y después no termine siendo C. Las entidades patrocinantes son las entidades que viabilizan esta demanda, con las que estamos siempre, que también pueden cargar información y cada uno de ellos tiene perfiles distintos de acceso. Los municipios pueden ver toda la demanda de su comuna, las entidades patrocinantes pueden ver solamente la demanda que cargan ellos de sus grupos con los que están trabajando. Las entidades de gestión rural son las que trabajan con el programa de habitabilidad rural, que también les conservamos la calificación socioeconómica, y 939 funcionarios de Servius, Seremi y Subsecretaría, que son también los que nos ayudan muchas veces en la gestión del registro y en el trabajo. Hicimos este panel municipal para incentivar a los municipios a cargar información. Entonces, ellos pueden visualizar toda la información que tienen en su comuna. Entonces, la cantidad de personas que atienden en temas de vivienda también queda un registro. Y después, cuando deciden realizar informes de demanda local, pueden acceder a los datos de ellos, descargarlos. Y eso también ha sido súper importante para poder aumentar las municipalidades con acceso que tenemos por región. Hay regiones que tenemos un 100% y hay bajando algunas que no tenemos ningún municipio porque hay algunos temas particulares entre los equipos regionales y esos municipios particulares. El rol de las regiones es muy, muy, muy importante, sobre todo para poder llegar a lugares donde nosotros no tenemos la capacidad o donde hay más informalidad, donde hay personas que tienen estas brechas tecnológicas para poder registrarse. Entonces, municipios que conocen ciertos lugares que es más difícil llegar, ellos van y pueden registrar a estas personas para que queden organizados y dentro de nuestra demanda habitacional y entender que hay ciertos sectores que también necesitan atención. Entonces, de esa manera vamos viendo cómo focalizamos mejor. También nos dan una alta retroalimentación respecto al sistema, porque ellos lo ocupan bastante. Entonces nos dicen, oye, esto lo podrían mejorar, esto está funcionando bien. Entonces nos sirve un montón para tener esta mejora continua. Y también esta vinculación de los datos con la realidad local, que les permite también identificar cuáles son los sectores que tienen más o menos atendidos de acuerdo a esta mirada territorial. Son claves para el éxito de esta plataforma y eso lo tenemos como súper claro hace bastante rato. ¿Y por qué es tan clave? Porque en las transformaciones demográficas existe una adaptación constante. Las personas van cambiando de ciudad de acuerdo al trabajo, los núcleos familiares van cambiando de tamaño, no toda la demanda es déficit. Nosotros trabajamos más con la demanda que con el déficit, incluimos el déficit dentro de nuestro trabajo, pero para nosotros el déficit son personas que viven en viviendas irrecuperables, que no, en el fondo que no tienen vivienda, allegados, hacinados o allegados. Entonces, si yo hoy, por ejemplo, estoy arrendando una vivienda, yo no soy déficit, pero si soy demanda, porque podría postular un subsidio de arriendo o una vivienda definitiva. Entonces, tenemos los dos datos y sobre eso vamos trabajando. Y los hogares también tienen realidades muy distintas que requieren soluciones diferenciadas. Nuestros programas trabajan a través de decretos y esos decretos nos indican cómo tenemos que trabajar. Entonces, muchos de nuestros programas construyen viviendas tipo para familias tipo, y no todas las familias son tipo. No todas las familias son con padre, madre y dos hijos. Entonces, al final también esto nos permite ir identificando qué tipos de proyectos tenemos que realizar y esto también, Mimbo Conecta participa en la construcción de un nuevo sistema público de acceso a la vivienda que se está diseñando, que tiene que ver con unas modalidades más flexibles que nos permitan trabajar mejor y que nuestros decretos no terminen siendo una especie de camisas de fuerza para entregar soluciones a las familias. Y acá un dato que sacamos, por ejemplo, en el censo de 1994, los tamaños de los núcleos familiares en Chile eran de 4 personas. En el censo del 2024 son como 2,8 y nosotros mismos Conecta tenemos 2,7. Entonces estamos bastante cerca de la información que tenemos de personas como demanda de la realidad nacional y eso también nos da ciertas luces para decir que vamos en un camino correcto. Los desafíos con los que nos encontramos casi siempre, lo que les decía antes, múltiples bases de datos, cada programa mantiene información, entonces cuando las modificamos, quedamos con muchas brechas y eso lo tenemos que mejorar. Ahí la inteligencia artificial nos ha ayudado y ahí tenemos que ir viendo cómo vamos rellenando, cómo vamos modificando estas bases y cómo podemos trabajar para hacerlo mejor. La demanda fragmentada, que es bastante difícil consolidar y entender la demanda real del territorio, si los datos no son lo suficientemente robustos. Y por eso nuestro principal trabajo durante todo este tiempo ha sido documentar, mejorar el diccionario de datos, trabajar mejor en la información que tenemos para que efectivamente el dato que tenemos de una familia sea el correcto y no le mandemos una información diciéndole, hola, nos gustaría que postulara a este subsidio vital y la persona nos conteste, pero si yo ya vivo en una casa que me entregó el ministerio hace 4 años. Eso no nos puede pasar. Entonces, esto es súper importante para el trabajo. Y lo que recién decía, información incompleta genera riesgo de ineficiencia y mala focalización. Entonces, lo que estamos haciendo hoy día ya es parte de la toma de decisiones desde el punto de vista financiero y otras herramientas, y eso va creciendo cada día respecto a la gestión de la demanda y los datos con los que estamos trabajando. Esto es gracias a que 3 de nuestros proyectos entraron en la agenda de modernización del Ministerio, que uno es gestión de la demanda, el que les que esta explicación, que gracias a eso armamos una ficha del ciudadano que tiene 40 variables que les disponibilizamos a las familias para que ellos vean en qué situación están y entiendan mejor, y finalmente a partir de esa caracterización los datos que le entregamos. Esto también nos permite, con esa caracterización, hay ciertos proyectos que se construyen y que todavía no tienen las familias asignadas, y la herramienta que tenemos hoy nos permite hacer esta prelación y este orden a partir de los criterios que se definan. Por ejemplo, familias que ya tienen un subsidio, que incorporen un adulto mayor, familias monoparentales, etcétera. Eso se pondera y después esto entrega una lista de prelación que permite decir, usted quedó en el puesto número 15 de esta lista por estos ítems, ¿le interesa o no le interesa participar de este proyecto? Si no, ya iba corriendo la lista. Y lo otro es el acompañamiento al ciudadano, que estamos trabajando junto al Sistema Integrado de Atención a la Ciudadanía, porque lo que hablamos antes de pasar de una comunicación reactiva a una proactiva es parte del cambio que queremos generar, entendiendo que tenemos un montón de información sobre las personas y a partir de esa información debiéramos poder dar mejores recomendaciones. El caso principal que siempre ocupamos es que, por ejemplo, hay programas de compra de vivienda en Chile que necesitan postular un crédito hipotecario. Y tenemos muchos adultos mayores que postulan ese programa. Pero al lado tenemos un programa de arriendo para el adulto mayor que se entrega durante toda la vida de la persona, del adulto mayor, con un copago muy bajito. Entonces nosotros no podemos obligar a ese adulto mayor a que no postule la compra, pero sí le podemos recomendar que vaya por el otro camino, que es mucho más certero, porque al menos en Chile nadie le va a dar un crédito hipotecario a una persona de más de 70 años. Entonces, esos son temas que nosotros conocemos y debemos poder transmitir. Y lo otro es un portal propio de oferta de vivienda que también ya lo estamos construyendo, donde finalmente poder hacer el match entre la caracterización que tenemos de la familia, la necesidad que tiene, el tipo de familia que tiene, acompañándolo durante todo este proceso con el acompañamiento, con todos los datos que tenemos, para poder después ofrecerle una vivienda de acuerdo a las necesidades y requerimientos que tiene. Entonces, con eso sentimos que vamos completando un círculo donde facilitamos el acceso a la vivienda. Si después la persona no le gusta, no quiere, puede seguir otros caminos. Pero al final nosotros estamos cumpliendo con el mandato que tenemos, que apoyar a las familias durante todo este viaje del usuario y durante todo este proceso para que sea lo más amable posible y logren el objetivo de encontrar su solución habitacional. Esto es lo que les decía, esto es volver a repetir lo que ya les dije. Priorizar objetivamente, apoyar las decisiones. Yo creo que la transparencia de este proceso es algo que también nos moviliza harto para que las personas entiendan por qué fue seleccionado él y no su vecino, siendo que pueden ser, en el fondo sus condiciones son muy parecidas. Entonces, ¿cuál fue la diferencia que permitió que el vecino entrara y él no? Nosotros tenemos que poder lograr transmitirlo y en eso estamos trabajando fuertemente. Ya estamos en operación, ya tenemos una resolución que nos permite la priorización de viviendas innominadas para la elaboración de nóminas y también apoyo a procesos críticos. Todos los procesos de reconstrucción, por ejemplo, hay casos donde el proyecto tiene 200 viviendas y las familias que necesitan una vivienda son 150, ¿qué se hace con esos otros 50 departamentos? Nos piden a nosotros, se arma esta lista de criterios, la plataforma ordena a las familias y después se lo ofrece a quienes quedaron seleccionados si les interesa acceder a una de estas 50 viviendas disponibles que sobraron del proyecto anterior. El acompañamiento, ¿por qué lo necesitamos? Y estos son datos del Sistema Integrado de Atención a la Ciudadanía. El 49% de las llamadas recibidas en el mismo valor fueron contestadas. O sea, hoy día, a través de las herramientas de contacto, no logramos abarcar todas las necesidades que tienen la ciudadanía de respuesta. La menor evaluación de satisfacción para las consultas es el canal digital, por esto mismo, porque finalmente es anticuado, no tenemos la capacidad de contestar todas las preguntas que nos hace la ciudadanía, pero el 86% quiere recibir información en correos electrónicos y el 60% quiere recibir información en celulares y el 65% realizaría trámites en línea. Entonces tenemos un universo de potencial de personas que están dispuestas a tomar este canal que para nosotros es súper costo efectivo en términos de realización y uso, para que a partir de esto podamos informar mejor y acompañar mejor a las familias. Y esto porque creemos que tenemos que poner al centro del ciudadano nuestra gestión y la información como pilar de guía, lo que hablábamos antes. Una persona con mejor información toma mejores decisiones. Si la persona no tiene toda la información, la pueden engañar y le pueden estar haciendo cobros indebidos. Entonces, la comprensión completa de las necesidades de las familias, seguimiento del proceso desde la perspectiva ciudadana. Ya hemos hecho estudios para saber en qué parte de los viajes del usuario las familias se sienten más solas, en qué parte les generan más frustración. Entonces tenemos claridad para que en esos momentos poder acompañarlas de una manera mucho mejor, más eficiente, etc. Y una visión integrada del sistema habitacional completo. Esto también tiene un cambio de lo que les decía recién. Ahora es una mirada de proceso. Entonces, todas las personas que estemos en un mismo proceso vamos a tener un aplicativo, no 5. Entonces, hoy ya se está trabajando en un proceso de postulación única, que es una sola plataforma de postulación, porque tenemos distintas plataformas de postulación para nuestros distintos programas, cuando finalmente consultamos los mismos datos. Entonces, esos son cambios de mirada que estamos implementando y que son, yo creo que nos van a llevar a que la percepción de la relación de la ciudadanía con el Estado sea mucho mejor. Información clara y oportuna, orientación personalizada y acompañamiento continuo. Esos son los pilares de este proyecto de acompañamiento, y porque creemos que la política habitacional debe adaptarse a tiempo y eso requiere mejor tecnología y mejores datos. Creemos que los datos son un activo del Estado, que creemos que no lo ocupa de la mejor manera y que finalmente personas que trabajan fuera del Estado, del Ministerio, hoy día manejan mejor nuestros datos y generan mejor información, y nosotros yo creo que debemos estar a la altura para poder responder de la misma forma. Focalizar mejor en los que más necesitan, acompañamiento efectivo de la ciudadanía, prevenir malas prácticas, como lo que les decía antes, el mal uso de la información y aumentar la transparencia. Y eso es más o menos el contexto de lo que estamos trabajando. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Felipe. It was really fascinating and well taken to have this view of what AI can bring to the demand side after we saw quite a bit about not only the potential, but already the realization on the supply side. And actually, in closing this webinar, I would like to take 3 takeaways, and that will really be the first one, that this transformation is not in the future. It is happening. It is something that was long in the making. Michael, at the beginning, showed us how essentially the ingredients from a scientific point of view were there already in the 1950s. It was the matrix algebra of the middle of the 19th century, the physics of the beginning of the 20th century, with the probability of the first half of the 20th century. And then it took 60 years of engineering to bring computers to the scale where they can have the processing power and the storage capacity of data that allows putting to use these essentially mathematical techniques. And now it is happening, and at a really staggering scale. We saw it, and that would be my second conclusion, that already the outcomes that are there in terms of changing the production stage, changing even before that the planning stage, the way in which, I'm repeating these processes that we heard from Gabriel, processes that took 1.5 years can now be run in 30 minutes. And so instead of being an exercise that you do once in a while, you can do that regularly. And it's even better than that in the sense that it also improves consultation, because you can make that available to developers, to citizens, so that everyone benefits from the information, and that can be mobilized also on the demand side. We heard examples from Antonella with a number of US examples. We just heard from Felipe about Chile, about how it can improve allocation systems, and which then raises questions that we've heard throughout, also with the interventions of Bruno as well, that when you do these advisory systems based on data, you benefit of all the wisdom that is accumulated in this data, all the lessons learned, but you all are also at the risk of repeating the mistakes that are in terms of past decisions that may have been biased, that are embedded in this data. So there is this trade-off in managing this inherent contradiction about using systems that, as Michael highlighted, are essentially about very elaborate, very powerful statistical systems, and therefore anchored into what's in the data. Before, and that would be my third and final takeaway, before they are taken up by humans, and there the governance that we put in place, the institutions that we implement to take advantage of this potential are going to shape the outcomes. It's definitely not the algorithms alone. It is what we collectively, through our governance systems, are making of these algorithms. So I really, myself and on behalf of everybody, really thank all the participants for giving us all this food for thought. And I give the floor with a lot of gratitude for the learning experience this has been. I hand out the floor back to Paloma.
Thank you very much, Boris. Well, we conclude not only this webinar, but the entire Housing 2.0, New Perspectives for Latin America and the Caribbean series, an initiative that has embedded us to question, rethink, and reimagine the future of housing in the region. Today's discussion has made it clear that artificial intelligence is not merely a technological tool. It represents a profound transformation in how we design, build, manage, and live in our cities. Through this session, several key insights have emerged. Data-driven systems and platforms are reshaping the entire housing value chain. The adoption of AI raises radically and challenges related to inclusion, ethics, and governance. From architectural design to public policy, we are entering a new era in which complex decision can be informed, but not replaced by algorithms. One central message stands out. Artificial intelligence will only be truly transformative if it is aligned with the public interest, grounded in the realities of Global South, and centered on people, especially those historically excluded from formal housing system, affordable housing. Our speakers and panelists have shared valuable perspectives. The need to understand cities as complex systems where prediction has inherent limits. The importance of identifying realistic entry points of AI adoption in Latin America and the Caribbean. The critical role of user-centered design and trust in developing digital solutions, and the tangible potential of integrating AI into architectural practice and urban decision-making. The city and the country case studies have also reminded us that robust, reliable, and interoperable data systems and the institutional capacity to use them are essential foundations for any meaningful application of artificial intelligence. This series leaves us with a clear conviction. The future of housing in Latin America and Caribbean will depend on our ability to integrate technological innovation with effective governance, social inclusion, and climate action. It is not only about adopting new tools, but about redefining how we think about and managing housing systems. We would like to express our sincere gratitude to our moderator, Boris, to our distinguished speakers and panelists, and to all participants who have joined us through this series. Your contribution has been essential in fostering a rich, critical, and action-oriented regional dialogue. These conversations do not end here. We warmly invite you to continue engaging with us in the 4th Regional Housing Forum, which is going to take place on September 21st and 22nd here in Washington, D.C. The forum aims to deepen the discussion initiative, which was initiated with this webinar series, showcase and position innovative inclusion and scalable solution and advance efforts to reduce the housing deficit in Latin America and Caribbean. It will be served as a platform to integrate evidence, emerging technologies, financing models, and a strategic partnership with a clear focus on reaching underserved population. The future is already here. The question is not whether we will live with algorithms, but how and for whom. Thank you very much for your participation. We will look forward to seeing you here in DC, September 21st, September 22nd, for the 4th Regional Housing Forum. Thank you.